Hi everybody, welcome to Wood Fired Weekly at Manna from Devon Cooking School. This week we're going to be talking about pizza and specifically pizza dough, the ins and outs, the technicalities of pizza dough and why there are so many different ideas and things floating around there and what they all mean and what the differences are. And that's what we're going to be covering in this little chat today. So first thing I'm going to do is show you how I make my standard pizza dough. In my bowl here, I've got 1,000 grams of 00 flour, 5 grams of instant yeast, 20 grams of salt, and I'm going to add to that about 650 grams of room temperature water. I always weigh my water because it is quicker and more accurate than squinting at the side of a pot, trying to read the little markings on the side of the pot. Much more accurate. And of course, 1 gram of water is 1 milliliter of water, so it's very simple conversion. I'm going to quickly mix together so that all the flour is wet. And we should find that we've got a slightly sticky dough there. So I'm just chopping with the scraper here so that I reveal the sticky inside of the dough, and that picks up the last remaining bits of flour. So I've picked up all the flour, a quick mix in the bowl, roll it around the edge to clean the bowl a little bit. And the dough is a little bit sticky, but not too bad. And if I pull a bit, as yet, it's not really very strong. Hasn't developed any strength. So I'm going to pop a cover on that and set it to one side whilst we talk about all the things that were going on in that bowl. So the first thing to talk about is the flour. That is, after all, the main ingredient of any dough is flour, which we are going to turn into something delicious. For pizza, you'll generally see that it's specified to use 00 flour. And this is just a specifically Italian grading of flour, which means it is very finely sieved, very finely milled and very finely sieved. And you'll find that most Italian or Italian-derived 00 flours are made from durum wheat. Durum wheat is a relatively hard wheat, which is easy to mill very finely, and then it can be sieved very finely so that there is absolutely no bran or germ left at all. And compare it side by side with a regular blended bread flour, you'll find that it feels a little bit more gritty, just a tiny bit more gritty. And if you look at it under a nice light, you'll see that it's a little whiter than a regular flour will be, because the bran and the germ in there are giving it a little bit more colour in the regular bread flour. And the reason you want to use 00 flour is because you'll get a more bubbly texture. And any of those lovely Italian breads like focaccias, ciabattas will have a more bubbly texture if you use 00 flour. I use this one from Shipton Mill. Shipton Mill mill their flour up in Gloucestershire. And I've always used this one. But there are lots out there on the market. But you really want one which is specifically for bread making or for pizza, because it'll have a higher protein content. And the 00 bit doesn't actually tell you anything about the protein content of the flour. When we make a pizza, we really want to be able to stretch it out nice and thin. If we use a flour which is too weak, which doesn't have a high enough protein content, it's just going to tear. So a regular plain flour really wouldn't cut the mustard. And 00 flour sometimes comes nice and weak and is great for cakes and biscuits, and sometimes it's nice and strong and ideal for pizza, and that's the one that we want. This one I know is good for pizza because on the side of the bag there it's got 12%. Some other recipes you'll find have semolina added to the mix, and semolina will significantly change the texture. So semolina is typically also made from durum wheat flour, but it's much less finely milled. So you get coarse semolina, and this is the stuff that you use for semolina pudding, which might send shivers down the spine of some people. And you get fine semolina, and this is sometimes called semola or semolina flour, and this is really the stuff you want. Nice and fine. And when you use this in it, or when you see this specified in a recipe, what you'll get is a much firmer texture. So a little bit more strength to it. It'll support a lot more weight. So if you want a dough which will carry a lot of toppings, a big old piled up pizza, then this might be suitable. But it's not specified in the real Neapolitan, the original Neapolitan recipe, which only has 00 flour. So that is definitely, whether you have some semolina or not, definitely a matter of choice. Then we have some salt. And salt is really important because primarily it affects the strength of the protein. Without it, protein is likely to fracture and break. Our dough is likely to split when we try and stretch it out. It'll be stickier to handle, it won't colour as well, it won't have any flavour at all. It'll be very disappointing in flavour if we don't add any salt. So you'll usually find quite a lot of salt in pizza recipes. And kind of a standard measure is 2% of the weight of flour. So in my recipe there, 1,000 grams of flour, 20 grams of salt, 2%. I'm using here a finely ground sea salt. And this is the stuff which, if it's in this bowl for too long, it sort of starts to clump together somewhat. I could use a fine table salt, but that always has an addition of some sort, an additive of some sort, usually to stop it from clumping together. And often people want to avoid any more additives than are absolutely necessary. So when you see a recipe that specifies sea salt or kosher salt, it's avoiding those additives. I could use the nice coarse ground stuff that chefs love, of course, those lovely flakes of Maldon salt or Cornish sea salt, things like that. The trouble with those is they don't necessarily distribute so well through your recipe. So if you were using those, it might be an idea to dissolve them in your water before you add the water to the recipe. Apart from that, absolutely perfect. Also in our bowl was some yeast. And I use this yeast. It's a quick yeast or a fast-acting yeast or an instant yeast. They're all the same thing. Very fine granules, which don't need any rehydrating. So you can throw this into a recipe. Almost as soon as it hits the water, it dissolves and distributes completely through the bread. So there's no need to rehydrate. If you were using dried active yeast, you would need to rehydrate it first. If you're using fresh yeast, then you can throw that straight into the recipe as long as it sort of gets broken up during the kneading process. So the difference between using this and fresh yeast, absolutely minimal in terms of the end product. I know some people will differ to that point of view, but I think the differences are absolutely so minimal as to be negligible. So I always use this. The trouble with fresh yeast is you never know how fresh it is when you buy it, and if you've had it for a little while, it really starts to tail off. So it's a little bit more hit and miss, whereas this is very, very predictable, and you know exactly where you are, and it comes with a shelf life of a year, so it's a really convenient way to make bread, especially for those of us who aren't using it every day. If you get a recipe which says use 10 grams of fresh yeast, then you probably want to reduce that to 3 or 4 grams of instant yeast. So you're down to kind of 2/5, something close to that. Now, how much yeast is also a question. And a kind of standard amount of yeast in bread is, for instant yeast, 1% of the weight of flour. Fresh yeast, 2% of the weight of flour. But you get pizza recipes with as little as 0.25, so a tiny amount of yeast to flour. And you might see that recipe and think that can't possibly be enough. But that recipe will be one which is being fermented for a long time, which means there's lots of opportunity for yeast to reproduce. And once these guys get going, once they've got some food and some warmth, producing lots of carbon dioxide, they're also reproducing every hour or so. So you get this exponential growth in the yeast. If you're making a recipe which is quite fast, so it's got maybe an hour's fermentation followed by shaping, and within 2 hours you're making your pizzas, that recipe will have more yeast in it. So you look at that recipe and you think, well, I want to make my recipe and I want to make it overnight, nice and slow. I can use a tiny amount of yeast. I want to make my dough. Oh, look, it's a lovely day. I'm going to go outside and make pizzas. You've got to get things going pretty quickly. Then you're going to use more yeast. Neither of those is right or wrong. It's just they kind of fit different circumstances. You might find, well, the other thing to mention about yeast, of course, is sourdough. And that would be a discussion on its own, because sourdough pizzas are something else. Again, rather more involved in the timings and how long it takes to make them, and of course a different flavour at the end. You might also find some recipes which have some element of sugar in them, and either a little bit of caster sugar, and sometimes you get recipes with a little bit of barley malt extract, which is basically a sugar. And sometimes they're there as an accelerant. So if you've got a quick recipe, that nice, warm, everything fast, hours fermentation recipe, that might have a bit of sugar to speed things up. Or they may be there as a browning agent to give you a nice golden colour in your crust. I've never found it necessary to add sugar to get a nice colour in the crust in the wood-fired oven. So I never use any sugar in there. There is plenty of sugar in flour, and once enzymes break it down and release maltose, there's plenty of sugar, so I've never found it necessary at all. And then you get some recipes which have some oil in there, usually olive oil, of course, because it's an Italian product. Whenever you add oil to a dough, it adds a little bit of flavour, of course, and it also has a softening effect on the dough. So you often get oil where you want to mask the fact that you're making bread quite quickly, and you want it to sort of soften the mouthfeel a little bit. You also get it where you specifically want it to soften the crust or the crumb, and to give a different sort of very soft texture to dough. So if you're making buttery buns and brioches and things like that, there's quite a lot of fat in various forms, eggs and butter and milk and so on, and they all have this softening effect on the dough. If you want a nice crispy crunch to your pizza, you probably don't want a lot of oil in there. And if you just put a tiny bit in, I'm not sure I really understand what it does apart from ever so slightly softening the crumb. But it is true to say that whatever you do to your dough, whatever things you mix in there, they will all change the dough subtly, if not considerably. So everything has a little effect. So having decided on our recipe and which of these ingredients we're going to use, we put our ingredients together, mix them up, and the next stage is kind of kneading or gluten development. And this is where we mix everything together and work it in some way in order to make sure that the gluten in there becomes nice and strong. And gluten is just a network of proteins in the dough which form sort of automatically, pretty much. And all they really need are some moisture, the original protein in the flour, of course, but some moisture and some energy so that the biochemical links can start to form. If we knead dough vigorously, we homogenize all the ingredients, so we make sure that everything is thoroughly mixed, but we also put lots of energy into the dough, which enables the proteins to develop really quickly. If we let the dough sit and do nothing after we've mixed it up, we'll still find that the proteins start to develop because they just do. It's what they biochemically are programmed to do. So this dough, when we gave it a little pull earlier, we found that it broke very easily. If I grab a bit now and give a pull, you can see that that's now already started to develop some real strength to it. But it looks a bit kind of lumpy and gnarly, so I want to smooth it all out with a little bit of kneading. And I'm going to tip this dough out of the bowl onto the table. Still a little bit tacky here and there, but we'll find now that that moisture disappears really quickly and the dough will become very dry. And if I give that a quick few turns on the table and then knead it a little and maybe rip it down a little, any of these is an acceptable way of kneading. Also putting it in bowl and letting the mixer do the work is an acceptable way of kneading. But now we see that that comes together really quickly, and after only moments I have a beautifully smooth, homogeneous, strong, elastic, springy piece of dough without having stood there for 15 minutes working away. And if I now leave this for a period of time, the protein will carry on strengthening with no help from me, because the dough has energy in it. So that's really all I need to do. So you can see that this dough now, nice and dry, it's lost all of its initial tackiness. And of course that is partly because it's absorbed all of that water, but it also relates to how much water was in the recipe. And this is something else where recipes differ considerably. So you might find that some recipes for a kilo of dough have 550 millilitres or grams of water, so 55% hydrated. You'll find some have as much as 700 grams or millilitres of water per kilo of flour, 70% hydrated. And mine had 650 grams of water, 65% hydrated. That's typically what I do, and it gives a dough which is nice and easy to handle. If you make the dough too tight, then it's kind of very difficult to stretch out and shape. And obviously if you have too much water, it just stays sticky the whole time and it's quite difficult to manage. But it also kind of depends on the outside temperature. If you know that your outside temperature is going to be really cold, and you make a dough with 55% water, then it'll never kind of lose its elasticity. If the outside temperature is much warmer, then you can make a drier dough, because it'll be much softer and easier to work with. So if you're following a Neapolitan recipe, that recipe was developed in Naples. If you're not in Naples, it might be different. So if you're making that recipe in Edinburgh in winter, you might find that it doesn't work and it's really elastic, and that's because you've got to take into account the outside temperature as well. On a really nice hot day in the summer, if you make your dough too sticky, so if you went for a 66 or 70% hydrated dough, you might find it was just too sticky to work with all of the time. So that's why there's such a lot of difference in water content as well. The other difference, of course, is how long we're now going to leave this dough for. Now, a lot of people like a nice quick recipe, which they start at 10 o'clock in the morning and they eat pizzas at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then everything is made quite warm. There's quite a lot of yeast. You might have a little bit of sugar in there to accelerate things, and that recipe will develop nice and quickly. The dough will rise, and you'll certainly be ready to eat those pizzas at lunchtime. But it may be that the dough doesn't have much character, and the longer you leave a dough, the more its character will change and develop. And now you'll find some recipes which are for 4 days or even 5-day recipes, where a dough is made, the water is cold, there's a tiny bit of yeast, and then the dough goes into the fridge and it stays there for 4 or 5 days, quietly changing in character all of the time. So the traditional pizza recipe for Neapolitan pizza, as laid down by the Real Pizza Makers Association of Naples, says you're to leave your dough like this at room temperature for 2 hours, and then shape it into a dough ball and leave it for a further 4 to 6 hours. And that's the recipe that everybody should be using wherever they are in the world if they're making an authentic Neapolitan pizza. And of course that recipe was developed when no one had a fridge, or refrigeration was scarce or difficult. So everything was done at room temperature. So that long fermentation, they didn't choose to do a short fermentation over a long fermentation. It's just that long fermentation wasn't really achievable, because if you left it for too long at room temperature in Naples, then it would just over ferment and the yeast would go crazy and the dough would be exhausted of sugar, and then it would be flabby and not very nice at all. So there is kind of a background to that. I like to make a dough which is pretty relaxed. So I like kind of a 4-hour fermentation in the bowl at least, if not overnight, and then shape my dough balls and leave them for an hour or two depending on the temperature outside before making the pizzas. And I find that gives a nice creamy mouthfeel to the dough. There's plenty of time for starches to absorb moisture and soften and become nice and creamy. The protein has lots of time to strengthen, so the dough is easy to handle, and it is a really nice all-round but simple recipe. But if some people are put off by the idea of starting the day before or starting that early in the morning, so go for a faster one. And you just cut your cloth according to your choice then, really. So that's my dough ready to sit and ferment. In next week's video, we'll be showing you how we use that to make pizzas, to shape, top and bake the pizza. If you've enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe to our channel. We'll provide notes and information on our blog, and there'll be a link to that below the video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.